In 1999, in the small town of Del Rio, Texas, the world was preparing for a new millennium. But inside one quiet home, a nightmare was unfolding. 10-year-old Krystal Surles was fast asleep during a sleepover at her best friend's house when a scream jolted her awake. Still groggy, she blinked into the dark room and froze. Just a few feet away, her friend, 13-year-old Katie Harris, was pinned down by a stranger. A shadow loomed over her. In his hand, a knife glinted in the moonlight. Before Krystal could move, the blade flashed. One strike, then another. Katie's scream cut short, her body falling silent. The man straightened, breathing heavily. For a moment, it seemed he would leave, but then he turned back. His eyes swept across the room, and in an instant, they locked on Krystal. She couldn't move, couldn't breathe. And then he lunged. The cold steel slashed across her throat. Pain seared through her body. She collapsed, blood pouring from the wound. Convinced he had silenced both girls, the man slipped out of the house and vanished into the Texas night. But he had made a terrible mistake. Krystal wasn't finished. Clutching her throat, fighting the darkness closing in, she forced herself to move. Every step was agony, but she staggered down the hallway, vision blurred, heart pounding. She pushed open the door and stumbled outside. Her bare feet carried her to a neighbor's home. She banged on the door with everything she had left. She tried to scream for help, but no sound came. The blade had severed her vocal cords. When the door opened, the neighbor froze in horror. Standing there was a little girl drenched in blood, a deep gash across her neck. Without hesitation, they dialed 911. Krystal collapsed into their arms. Doctors fought to save her life. Against all odds, she survived, but her voice was gone. She could no longer speak. For investigators, she was the only witness, and yet she had no voice to describe her attacker. Still, Krystal refused to give up. Communicating through gestures and scribbled words on paper, she sat with a forensic artist. Slowly, painfully, she began to sketch the face of the man who had destroyed her childhood. His eyes, his hair, the details that haunted her dreams. When the sketch was complete, investigators recognized him instantly. A drifter who had been moving across America for years, leaving a trail of blood in his wake. His name was Lynn Sells. Sells wasn't just a killer, he was one of the most dangerous serial killers America had ever seen. For decades, he drifted from state to state, taking lives at random. His victims had no pattern: men, women, children, hitchhikers, families who had shown him kindness. His nickname became the coast-to-coast killer because his murders stretched across the entire country. His weapon of choice was always the same: a knife. His motive was terrifyingly simple: impulse. For years, police never connected the crimes. He moved too fast, left too few ties. But in 1999, that changed. A 10-year-old girl with her throat cut open lived long enough to identify him. Police moved quickly. When they confronted Sells, he broke. He confessed not only to Katie Harris's murder, but to dozens of others across the nation. Some confessions matched unsolved cases. Others could never be proven. But investigators believe the number of his victims might have reached 70. In 2000, Lynn Sells stood trial for the murder of Katie Harris and the attempted murder of Krystal Surles. And in that courtroom, the girl who had lost her voice found another way to speak. She took the stand, pointing, writing, gesturing, telling the jury exactly what had happened that night. The defense tried to discredit her, but her courage was undeniable. The jury believed her. Sells was found guilty. He was sentenced to death. For years, he sat on death row in Texas, boasting about his crimes, showing no remorse. But his time ran out. In April of 2014, the coast-to-coast killer was executed by lethal injection. And the reason he was caught wasn't police genius or forensic science. It was the willpower of a 10-year-old girl who refused to die. In 2014, inside a Texas prison chamber, Lynn Sells, the infamous coast-to-coast killer, was executed by lethal injection. For the families of his victims, it felt like justice had finally been served. For 10-year-old survivor Krystal Surles, it meant the monster who had stolen her voice was finally gone. But what no one realized that night was that his death wasn't the end of the story. Only months after the execution, strange reports began to surface. New killings were spreading across different states, and they carried the same chilling hallmarks of Sells' crimes. Families murdered in their sleep, victims stabbed with brutal precision. At first, investigators dismissed it as coincidence. A knife is a common weapon, and random acts of violence happen every day. But then survivors began describing their attacker. He was a drifter, a transient. And disturbingly, he looked eerily similar to Lynn Sells. It was impossible. Sells was dead, pronounced and buried. So how could his crimes be continuing? The FBI was forced to reopen his files. They combed through the hundreds of cases tied to his name. Sells had once bragged of killing dozens, maybe even hundreds, but many of his confessions had never been proven. Some were outright lies. But what if others weren't lies at all? What if they had been murders committed by someone else entirely? Buried deep in old case reports was a disturbing rumor. In his drifting years, Sells wasn't always alone. He had been seen traveling with other men, drifters who lived in the shadows like he did. One of them, a man who had disappeared back in the 1990s, matched the descriptions survivors of these new attacks were now giving. The possibility was terrifying. Maybe Lynn Sells hadn't been a lone predator. Maybe he had a partner. For Krystal, the thought was crushing. She had survived the unthinkable. She had testified against him in court. She had lived with her scars and worked tirelessly to rebuild her life, believing the nightmare ended the day Sells was executed. But now she was confronted with the idea that another man could still be out there. Another man who might have been present on the night she was attacked, watching, waiting, and maybe even killing again. In 2015, the FBI quietly assembled a multi-state task force. Their mission was clear: re-examine every unsolved case connected to Sells. The deeper they looked, the more disturbing it became. Some of Sells' confessions simply didn't add up. The dates didn't line up. He was proven to be in one state while supposedly confessing to a murder hundreds of miles away in another. He couldn't have been in two places at once. So why confess to killings he couldn't have committed? Some investigators believed it was ego, a way to inflate his reputation and go down in history as the ultimate killer. But others began to suspect something darker. Maybe he wasn't lying to take credit. Maybe he was lying to protect someone else. Evidence supporting that theory had been sitting in plain sight for years. On the night of Krystal's attack, neighbors reported seeing not one man, but two men, walking away from the house. At the time, police dismissed the account as unreliable. Fear and confusion, they said, could distort memory. But now, with new killings unfolding, that forgotten statement took on chilling new weight. Had there been an accomplice that night? By 2017, whispers of a second man spread quietly among investigators. Survivors of newer attacks described him with chilling consistency: scarred hands, a limp in his walk, a cruel, mocking laugh that burned into their memory. One victim even swore the man gave a name. Investigators refused to make it public, but the implication was clear. Someone else was out there, still hunting. For Krystal, the fear returned with full force. She had once been the girl who survived the coast-to-coast killer. But if another man had been with Sells that night, he would know the truth. He would know she lived, and she could identify him. Then in 2019 came the revelation that changed everything. A cold case from Missouri was reopened, and DNA evidence from the scene was finally processed with advanced technology. The crime matched Sells' style perfectly, but the DNA didn't belong to him. It belonged to someone else. The man's identity remains hidden, but the proof was undeniable. He was real, he was alive, and he was still free. For the families who believed justice had been delivered with Sells' execution, the news was devastating. Had the wrong man taken credit for their loved ones' deaths? Had the real killer escaped entirely? The FBI tried to contain the information, but whispers leaked. Cold case detectives across the country began pulling out dusty files, comparing DNA, searching for matches. And piece by piece, the chilling possibility grew stronger. Lynn Sells had not acted alone. For Krystal, the discovery reawakened her worst fears. She had ended one monster's reign of terror by surviving, but now she lived with the knowledge that another man, perhaps even more dangerous, was still out there. A man who might consider her his unfinished business. Lynn Sells is gone, but his shadow hasn't disappeared. Another man, faceless, nameless, but proven by DNA, may still be walking free. And the most terrifying part? Authorities believe he isn't finished. If this story gripped you, then you already know. Monsters don't only hide in the dark. Sometimes they hide in plain sight. So don't miss what's coming next. Hit subscribe now and join me for part 3, because the nightmare is far from over.